and fiduciaries only. It's invitation only. And this event today is the second in a three-part series on universal life. It's sponsored by TFP Brokerage and Policy Check. And by the way, if you have any questions, please type them in the question area provided for you, and we will answer them at the end. My name is Mike Smith. I'm president of TFP Brokerage, and Steve Hutchison, who is founder and president of Policy Check, will be presenting later on in this event. So let's go ahead and get started. Zach, can you turn over the controls to me, please?
Mike, do you have it?
No, you have it.
I've passed them over. You should be able to move everything around.
Okay.
Gonna try one more time.
I see that it's over to me. Hold on just a second. Let me see.
Sure thing.
Screen moves.
There you go.
There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I apologize for those of you that have attended in the past, because we're going to cover a little bit of past ground, but let's start with some really foundational information about why people establish ILITs. In my mind, people establish ILITs to apply for and own life insurance on themselves or them and others. That is primarily a liquidity or estate planning tool. It could be debt, paying off debt, and there's other good reasons to establish an ILIT. The benefits of an ILIT are that if properly maintained, the ILIT will be removed from the estate, will not be estate taxable at the death of the grantor or the insured, and will be exempt from income tax and should be creditor protected. And so again, it's a long-term liquidity strategy, and so it's our experience that most ILITs that are institutionally managed, the administrative aspects of the ILIT are done very well. The crummy letters and retention of those records, the payment of premiums, all the stuff that needs to happen in an ILIT to make sure that from an administrative standpoint the ILIT is handled properly. The problem is that in most, or about half the ILITs that we see, the life insurance policy actually is the problem. That's the thing that is most problematic about most of the ILITs that we see. And so that's why we're talking today, and that's why we're putting together these series of events. Zach, go ahead and you've got the control again, so go ahead and just move to the next screen for me, please. There we go. So we do have some guidance from regulatory authorities on what's the what's the best way to manage ILITs, or what's the appropriate way to manage ILITs. And the first one is from OCC, August 2012 handbook. Their guidelines say that the ILIT fiduciary should protect and manage the policy for the benefit of the beneficiaries. You should understand the policies that you've accepted the responsibility to manage, and if you don't understand the policies, you should retain a third party to help you with that. That you should review the policies annually, and that review should involve a review of the carrier's financial strength, whether the policy is performing as projected, and whether replacement should be considered. We also have guidance from Nebraska Supreme Court in a case recently ruled on in November of last year and filed in February of this year. And in their opinion, wrote that an ILET trustee needs to agree upon who's going to monitor the policy, always do, manage the policy in the best interest of the beneficiaries, and keep the beneficiary informed. Okay, so next screen, Zach, please. All right, so I believe this is really good guidance for all of us in terms of what is the role of the life insurance fiduciary or trustee. And that is to protect, manage, and monitor the policy for the beneficiaries, understand the policy, and the riders and options, or retain a third party to help you do that. Those three areas we just discussed about in the policy review should involve those three items, and then always keeping the beneficiaries informed. Next slide. Okay, so for those of you that attended last week, you'll be familiar with this 10-point checklist on universal life. Steve is going to review his suitability analysis and policy review process later on in this discussion. So this is our 10-point checklist as a guide. If you're managing universal life, this is the step that you should follow. If anybody would like this after the presentation, I'm happy to send it to you. Just send me an email. You'll see my email at the end of the presentation. So next screen. All right. So let's take a look at an actual scenario that we dealt with a couple of years ago. And this was, we were asked to come in. There were three policies involved in this ILET. The son was the trustee, who happened to be an attorney, and he and his sister were beneficiaries of this trust. And so they engaged us to take a look at, there's three policies in this trust. There's $9 million of face amount. And when we ordered the illustration, in-force illustration on this particular policy, this is what we got back from the carrier. And this conversation on this policy is particular to no lapse guarantee universal life. So as you can see, the original illustration that we received showed the policy was going to lapse in this policy year, which nobody was aware of that. Okay, next screen. So when we reordered the in-force illustration, asking for what we would need to pay and asking for why this policy was going to lapse, what we would need to pay now to make up, to catch up on this policy, and then have them pay the same amount of premiums quarterly that they had been paying. This is what we got. So in other words, these folks have been paying $38,000 a quarter on this policy for 7 or 8 years, and what happened was they missed one premium payment. So one $38,000 premium payment, and so the makeup provision on that was this $121,000. I believe, if I recall correctly, there was one $38,000 premium left in that year still to pay. So it was really about an $80,000 penalty for the makeup provision. But then the policy didn't last until age 100 at the premiums that they had been paying all along. And they had bought the policy based on a no lapse guarantee of $38,000 a quarter of premium payments would get them to age 100 on a guaranteed basis. And you can see that this policy is lapsing in another 8 or 9 years. Next screen. So then we reordered an illustration asking for what it would take to get this policy to age 100 with a no lapse provision, because that's the only way anybody would ever keep this policy. And this is what we got. So in other words, it ended up costing them about that $38,000 premium payment that they missed ended up costing them about $160,000 in a makeup provision and another $8,000 a quarter in premium to get it to age 100 on a guaranteed basis. And as you can see, this policy on a guaranteed basis, which is the middle column here, will make it on that premium schedule to age 100. And you can see that this no lapse guaranteed universal life has very little cash value as represented in the policy value columns. All right. So next screen. So what do we learn by this? Well, first of all, a universal life is not a universal life is not a universal life. They all work very differently. All types work differently, and even amongst carriers work differently. So, but no lapse guarantees have to be managed very carefully. And the premiums cannot be paid too early or too late, or it can be very expensive, as you just saw in the previous example. Interestingly enough, and we talked about this last week, had they paid that $38,000 too early, in other words, more than 30 days early, they would have been looking at a violation of their no lapse in a similar way. I can't say it had been the same numbers, but they would have, in this particular policy, been looking at a no lapse violation and a makeup provision that would probably have been very similar to the one you just saw. And so you just have to be very, very careful in these no lapse guaranteed policies to make sure that these premiums are paid on time, that you're retaining record of when you paid it, when you sent it, and then you're checking annually on your no lapse provision to make sure the carrier's records match yours. Because we have seen proof of people paying premiums within the required period of time, and the carrier not acknowledging that, and we've had to get that corrected. So you just have to be very, very careful with these no lapse universal lives. Next screen. So this is another situation we dealt with this one this year actually. This is a current assumption universal life, so it works very, very differently than the type universal life we just looked at. In this case, if you look at up in the sort of the top right-hand corner, the third line down, it says premium paid to date $300,000. These folks paid $300,000 towards this policy back early on in its life, thinking that they had a paid-up policy. So when we started looking at the in-force ledger, this is what, when we ordered the first in-force ledger based on paying no premiums, this is what we got. It's showing that the policy will last 4 more years, as indicated in the far right-hand column. So, the guaranteed values are the 3 numbers in the middle columns, and you can see that the guarantees in this policy are based on a guaranteed interest rate and guaranteed monthly deductions, okay, which are not very realistic in terms of the guaranteed monthly deductions, but the guaranteed interest rate is very realistic. And so, anyway, this policy, the trustee should have been alerted there might have been something wrong with this policy. As you can see, the cash values are dropping rather substantially, which is the second to right and the third to right columns. All right, so what was our reaction to this? Next slide. Wrote back to the carrier and asked them for some what would it take to get this policy to age 100, and this is what the level premium amount was, $60,000 a year. Next slide. Another option, because they didn't have an appetite to pay $60,000 a year right now, was do an incremental schedule. And in fact, we ended up running about 12 different scenarios for these folks to give them various options as to what they could do with this policy, including dropping the face amount and paying some amounts. And in this particular case, the outcome of this is yet to be determined. The beneficiaries were involved in this conversation along with the grantor, and they have not actually made a decision as to what they're going to do with this. But these are both 2 examples of policies that have gotten, sort of out of whack, for lack of a better term, but they're very different policies, and the resolution or the remediation to these policies is these 2 different type of policies was very different as well. And so, in both of these scenarios, the insured was not insurable, so that was not an option to us. And so what we did was we just worked on fixing the existing policies. Next slide. All right, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but in our world, when we come across a policy that is at risk, the first thing we want to do is get some basic health information, which is this this page right here, completed by the ILET trustee. All right, and we think that this is a very critical part of your job as an ILET trustee or fiduciary, because what you're doing is managing a mortality unit, which is your insured. And to manage a mortality unit, you have to understand what the health of that person is periodically to make as as good a determination as you can as to how long this person might live. So how long so that would dictate to you how you manage this policy to see that it pays off and meets trust objectives. So we believe this is a critical part of our process, because this lets us know whether it lets us know a general idea of life expectancy. It lets us know a really good idea of whether they're insurable or not, and so whether alternatives might be considered. And if not, then it lets us hone in on the fact that we need to work on the existing policy to get that fixed, just like the prior two examples. Okay, so we think this is something from your standpoint that demonstrates an extra level of compliance and attention to the job that you're providing as a fiduciary on this policy and this island. Next screen. Okay. So here's another example of something that you have to be aware of that just happened as of yesterday. And normally we don't put carrying materials out here, but I think it's important for you guys to see, what's taking place here with Transamerica policies. And so this is a letter that went out to policy owners yesterday, and I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but this is the key element of this letter: what's changing and why. Transamerica is raising their expenses on their block of universal life business. I believe it's between 1997 and 2008. I don't know that for a fact, and we don't know the exact percentage because it's probably going to vary by policy series. But what this should alert you to is if you are managing a block of Transamerica universal life policies, you should be aware of the fact that there's going to be some increased expenses which could materially affect the performance of that policy. Okay, and so while this is not that common, I think there's it does exist the possibility that we might see more of this going forward, especially in carriers that have had some mortality risk issues. All right. So when ordering an in-force ledger to start the process of evaluating or the review process on your policies, it's important that you order the right kind of information from the carrier. As if you don't tell them what you want specifically, it's sort of the garbage in, garbage out theory, because a lot of times what you get is not anywhere close to what would be realistic or what you should get, or what you should expect from that policy. And we have these, and we'll do a presentation on each policy type that you can use. This is a simple template. This will be a takeaway from today as well, that we will send you after this presentation. And again, I'm not going to read this to you because it's a 3-page document, but this will, in our mind, give you clear guidance as to how to structure a written ILET policy review and remediation process that will support you in any kind of compliance, regulatory, or potential client complaint situation, so that you can demonstrate that you've been doing what you're supposed to be doing if you follow this process. Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Zach, you got the controls over there for me? So we're just going to go through a basic suitability update as Policy Check performs it, because it'll help give you some insight into some of the things you need to be looking at when you're dealing with a policy that we define as at risk. The first page of this suitability update just basically covers your boilerplate information, as well as the original underwriting class of that policy that you're managing. Down at the bottom, we have a third-party review that we have performed here, and one of the areas that's very important in your fiduciary responsibility is the funding adequacy of a particular policy. And on this particular policy, it shows that the funding is inadequate, and the way that's actually determined is by determining the lapse date of the current in-force policy, which in this case is 2023, and then we basically use the BBT tables, and we calculate what is the probability of this person. She is age 79 at the time that we ran this report. So the question is, what is the probability of her still being alive in 2023? In other words, what is the percentage chance that this trust could actually fail as far as a protection mechanism for that particular trust? And that is 65.33%. Let me go on to the next. Okay, on the top of the second page, we start out with a baseline comparison, and you can see where the current policy for Janice here was $1 million face with $3,000 annual premium is what she's currently paying. The duration age for that is age 87. So age 87 is the age that she will attain in the year 2023, and there's a 65% chance that she's going to survive that date. So the first thing we look at is what can we do with that current policy to make it adequately funded? And the easiest answer is that we can modify the funding. So when you're looking at modifying the funding, the in-force illustration that would represent the premium shows that we would need $25,505 in annual premium to take this policy to its current maturity age, which is age 95. So that's a pretty substantial jump in premium, and represents a deterioration of the interest rates over the years that she's had this policy. So the other option that you have is that you could reduce the face amount so that the $3,000 annual premium would have enough premium to carry the policy to maturity at the reduced face. And in this case, the estimated amount for that would be $396,000. So maybe the answer isn't here, and maybe the answer isn't here, but it's somewhere here in the middle. Now, at Policy Check, before we would make any type of determination on this, we would want to take a intermediate step, and that would be we'd want to do a health assessment of this particular insured to kind of see whether the options could lean towards a definite need to modify that policy, or if they're in extremely bad health, we might want to reassess how inadequately funded the policy is. So you can't make a full determination on a life insurance policy until you weigh in that factor of where they are health-wise relative to the general population. So with that, we go on to the next page. And the top portion of this comparison shows the baseline comparison again, which the $3,000 current premium taken at age 87. And then what we did is we went out to the marketplace and we did a competitive analysis based on what's currently available in the marketplace. And assuming that Janice had similar or pretty close to the same health as she did in the original policy, she could acquire a $1 million policy for $15,678 that would guarantee it to age 95. So kind of an apples and apples comparison would save her $7,827. Now, an important thing about whenever you're looking at replacing a policy as part of the remediation, you want to make sure that in this case we're operating under the assumption that the death benefit, a maximum death benefit, is the objective of that trust. If the trust had a secondary objective or another objective that was primary over maximum death benefit for the minimum premium, then that might result in a different type of policy, or maybe even she might be better in the policy that she's currently with. So you have to be very careful that you understand the objectives of that trust and the objectives of the beneficiaries and the grantor of that trust when they set it up, so that your policy recommendations or remediation matches that. The final example there would be to reduce the face amount on a new policy and see if we couldn't acquire a greater death benefit for the same premium. And in this example, Columbus Life would offer $644,000 coverage for the same $3,000, which is a $248,000 improvement. So once again, whenever you're remediating a policy, it's a process. You have to start with, exact and realistic objectives of what they're trying to accomplish with the trust. And, from that, you can take a look at the options out there and determine whether that can be best achieved by modifying the current policy or looking at what else is available in the marketplace. Anyway, we would like to thank everybody for taking 25 minutes to join us today. Next week, same time, same place, on Tuesday, June 23rd, we're going to be covering how to structure a policy review, and we're going to actually show you the details of a remediation process that'll withstand any type of fiduciary standard or review or any type of regulatory oversight into the process. In other words, something that's extremely bulletproof. So you can get a lot of good information out of that. And if you have any questions, you can email us, give us a call. And once again, we appreciate your time, and we'll see you next week.